Hi folks, my name is Michael Neff. I'm the founder and director of Gears Sports, and today we're going to do a video on shaft movement and how we need to consider that inside the Gears software. So the golf shaft moves in three directions. We call this lead deflection, we call this lag deflection, okay? This is a right-handed club. Or it can droop, so it basically goes into positive droop, or at the top of the swing it goes into negative droop. And then we also have twisting, so X, Y, Z, droop, deflection, and twist. And in Gears, we measure all three of these very accurately. We have markers on the club head and on the shaft that are being tracked at 0.2 millimeters, which is the thickness of a piece of paper. So our club data is trusted by the best companies in the world. The #1 shaft company uses Gears for all of our research testing, and we're really proud to be a part of that. So this is an example of Rory McIlroy at impact, and as you can see here, the club is in slight what we call lead deflection, meaning that that's kind of in that direction that way. It's also drooping, as you can see here. The shaft is drooping, and it's also twisting. So in his case, on this particular shot, the shaft had 49 millimeters of shaft droop, okay? And it had 22 millimeters of shaft deflection. And we do that in millimeters. And then we also have shaft twist is 1.3 degrees open. So real quick on shaft twist. Shaft twist means that the lower the torque on the shaft, the more leftward bias, or the more that club face closes. And I'll give you a little example of that. So I'm going to stand right here in front of you, and let's pretend that this shaft has zero torque. The shaft itself has no torque, meaning that it's rebar, it's just stiff as a plank, and there's no give in it at all. Let's just say that for example. We would say that if this shaft has zero torque, if I twisted the grip 1 degree, the head would go with it 1 degree. So, and if this club had 10 degrees of torque, okay, if I twisted it 1 degree at a higher speed, it would oscillate more than a really stiff shaft would. And our research shows that the lower the torque, the more the head stays with the grip speed, for a lack of a better term. So that's basically how that shaft moves. So the lower the torque, the more that head stays with the grip. That's kind of a layman's term that a lot of golf pros and golf people might understand. The softer the torque, the more it actually kind of lays back. The other thing that happens is the longer the club gets, like a pitching wedge doesn't droop very much, a driver droops the most because it's the longest club. So the longer the club gets, the more the shaft droops. Something else also happens. When the shaft droops, the lie angle goes toe down and the face angle opens. So the more the shaft droops, the more the face opens. Okay? But we have to consider three degrees here. We can't just think of one or the other. They're all fighting against each other. So it's all constantly moving and twisting and fighting each other. So we got to figure out at impact what's going to be the best shaft for all of us. You know, what's best. We all deliver it differently. So, for example, Rory McIlroy only has 3 degrees of shaft lean at impact. He starts with -3 degrees of shaft lean. That looks like 0, but it's actually -3. And he lands at pretty much 0 shaft lean, and the difference is +3 degrees. So he has a little bit of what's called positive shaft lean net. So or the sum is net is positive. And there's tour players that, like Cam Smith has even more, and Dustin Johnson has more. Most likely the shut players have a lot of shaft lean, and but there's a lot of players that have actually slightly negative shaft lean. So basically what's happening as the club comes in, if you lean the shaft forward like this, and you keep kind of leaning the shaft with a lot of shaft lean, what that does is that slows down the club head speed, and it keeps the club head speed or the club from deflecting a lot. So the more I drag the handle, the less the shaft will deflect. Okay? When we look at the down the line angle, okay, the more the shaft goes this direction, the handle goes this way direction, the more the shaft will droop. It's kind of like a fishing pole. So if I got a big fish on the end of my pole and I start to pull up on it, okay, that shaft is going to droop. The center of mass of the club is always trying to line up with the shaft. So as I pull that shaft up in this manner, it's going to create more drooping and the face will go more open. So Bryson's a good example of somebody that basically doesn't have he has the lowest shaft droop of any tour player. And that's because he basically starts with his wrists and a lot of ulnar deviation. The handle's pointed like this, the grip is really high, and he basically returns it to that spot. So Bryson does not have a lot of this action, up and down action, okay? And so he doesn't have a lot of shaft deflection, a lot of shaft droop, and that's because he's not moving it this way. So Rory has some shaft droop, roughly, 50 millimeters. This is a pretty stiff shaft he's playing here. He has roughly, the difference between the handle is 11 degrees, so he kind of moves the handle up like that. Most tour players do that. The old school guys like Lee Trevino and Ben Hogan and guys like Sergio, they keep the handle down more. The delta, the difference between the start and the finish is really low on those players, and they don't have a lot of shaft droop. So again, the more we move the shaft up and down this way, the more shaft droop we get. The more we drag the handle, the less shaft deflection we get. The more we throw the handle, okay, or the head, more like this, or the less shaft lean we have, the more deflection we have. Okay? Now, that's the two axes. Now you have the third axis of twist. So as the shaft droops a lot, the more it droops, what that's doing is it's fighting against the torque. So we had this example with Cam Smith where he was having a hard time drawing the ball, but the shaft was drooping like crazy. So he had a big low to high. We're going to do a video on him too, but he had this big low to high movement. So the shaft was really drooping, almost 65 millimeters. That's a lot. So, and the more it droops, the harder it is to twist. So he was really having a hard time turning over that driver. So if we want the ball to cut, having that droop is not the worst idea. Brooks Koepka has the most droop of anybody. So very, very, comes down pretty steep, lots of rotation, handle's pretty high. The most shaft droop of anybody, lowest closure rate, which we'll do another video on. But that shaft droop, the more it droops, the less it's going to torque or twist to the left. And the more the face is going to open. So this is one of the challenges that we have in the modern product. The drivers now are more upright than they've ever been, and they're longer than they've ever been. So part of that is the longer, part of the companies do this because they make the drivers really upright because the shafts now bend more and they droop more than ever before because they're longer. So part of the reason why the companies make the lie angle so upright with drivers and the modern drivers because the shaft is so long. However, that can backfire if you're not a low to high handle player. And the shaft then doesn't droop that much and the lie angle becomes really upright, and then that's where a lot of guys miss left. And so you have to match all that up. So in summary, what we're really kind of looking for is we want to be able to measure the droop, deflection, and twist, and we're matching that up to the players, what they really want. If you're a handle dragger, okay, like a Dustin Johnson, somebody that's pretty shut and kind of leans it forward, or a Cam Smith or somebody like that, that shaft isn't going to deflect a lot. You might not need really stiff. But if you're handle dragging and raising the handle and that shaft starts drooping too much, you might need a stiffer shaft if you don't want it to peel right so hard. Okay? So you have to consider all three axes when you're doing this. The best way I know how to do this is to use gears. Gears gives you a very clear, very accurate definition of what the club's doing over and over. I've measured hundreds of touring professionals at the highest level the best players in the world, and honestly, nobody delivers it the same way. I've yet to see anybody do the same thing. And everybody needs different shafts for different reasons. So if we're not measuring that, we're really in trouble. The other thing that I want to finish on here is that most of the shaft companies, in all their glory, they have usually three different profiles. They have a white, a red, and a blue, or they have a mid, low, and high. Whatever, however they want to kind of spin that. And what most people, most golf professionals that I've run into they're considering, mostly when they look at shafts, they're just thinking about up and down, like how much spin it has. So if I want to keep the spin down, I go with a lower launching shaft. Or if I want to get more spin, I go with a higher launching shaft. That's great, but that's only considering that one deflection, that one axis. And what we know is that all these things work in 3. They're all X, Y, Z. That's how the world works in 3D. So what we need to start thinking about when we look at shaft delivery is not just up and down, but left and right. Okay, and we've done a lot of robot testing on this. We're having a lot of success with this, specifically on the PGA Tour right now with tour players, is that the lower the torque the shaft, the more leftward bias it is. The higher the torque, the more rightward bias. And we're seeing an epidemic of tour players right now that do not want to hit it left, and more guys are wanting to hit cuts. The modern driver and the modern ball allow us to kind of hit these cuts that don't spin that much. So I want you to think that through, though, when you're fitting golf clubs and when you're using gears, is that you don't want to just think about up and down. You also want to think about left and right. Remember, the lower the torque, the lower the spin, the more left. So if you have a player that's, the average golfer that's hitting high slices, a really draw bias head with a very low torque shaft works really well. If we give a slicer a really high torque shaft that's super soft, and most of these slicers are coming down steep and they're pitching the club like this, in our data showing that shaft is drooping so much, and that's opening the face a lot, and that's the last thing we want for a slicer. So these draw bias heads kind of counteract that, but the shaft itself is flattening so much, it's opening that face so much that it's hard for them to square it up. So you might want to consider that as you go forward. Gears is in the process of designing some very unique shafts. We really are looking at building a very lightweight, low torque shaft for just that high slicer that something that help them square the face up a little better, but it's not heavy. And many of the shafts today, usually the low torque shafts are on the heavier side of things because you need more material to get that torque down. But the technology is getting so much better now that you can get lightweight, low torque, and we're pushing the limits on that. So anyways, that's an overview of XYZ, deflection, droop, twist. It's really important that you use gears to measure this, or else you're just guessing.